and broke its promise to the people of Kapiti.
Julianne Genter.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the second reading of the Land Transport Management Amendment Bill. I have to say that sitting through the Select Committee process on this bill was quite discouraging. Similarly to the government's asset sales legislation, their gutting of the Resource Management Act, their gutting of the Local Government Act, it was another example of a charade of democratic process. So during the Select Committee hearings, we heard a large number of really excellent submissions, and I have a huge stack of them right here. They were well informed. They were made by people who work on the ground on transport issues, people in regional councils, local councils. We heard submissions from very concerned citizens who are wondering how New Zealand is going to respond to climate change with its transport spend, how New Zealand is going to reduce the burden of chronic disease on the health system, which is actually increasing because of our transport system, and how New Zealand is going to deliver a transport system that works for everyone, including the elderly, the very young, those on low incomes, and those with disabilities. Despite some very strong, consistent themes in the submissions, there were very few changes made to the first draft of the bill. And I regret to say that some of the very young and earnest submitters, ordinary citizens who care enough about New Zealand to participate in the supposedly democratic process we have for improving legislation, were treated very poorly by some of the government members on the committee. Like so much else, the government did not listen to stakeholders. They voted on every part of the bill with their one-seat majority on the Select Committee. It was a 5-4 split on every part of the bill. And like so many other controversial things this government is doing, it has used its very narrow majority to force changes that do not reflect the views or concerns of most New Zealanders. And I'll talk in detail about the parts of this bill that are the most problematic during the committee stages of the House today. There are quite a few. I will just touch on a few right now. In my minority report, I highlighted my concerns with the lack of response to the submissions about changing the purpose of the Act, changing the makeup of regional transport committees, borrowing to pay for projects in the National Land Transport Program, going to public-private partnerships, essentially a more expensive way of borrowing for some very low-value highway projects like Transmission Gully, the removal of the regional fuel tax, which would have allowed a region like Auckland and perhaps other regions to raise revenue that they desperately need for their transport priorities. But right now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak to my concerns about the new public transport operating model that the government has spent so much time on with existing bus operators. Now, the purpose of the public transport operating model is supposedly to improve the competitiveness of public transport operators, when in fact we see it does the exact opposite. Much of the detail is not in this legislation. It will be set by order in council by the minister. But what I have learned through talking to specialists in the area is that the new public transport operating model entrenches the existing monopolies of existing bus companies. What it does is protect existing bus companies from having to compete in the provision of bus services. And this may be true for other providers as well. Essentially, what's going to happen if there isn't proper competition in the provision of public transport services because, for example, we're not even going to have tenders, we're going to have negotiated contracts on competitive routes like the Northern Express. At the moment, average tenders are only 1.1, so obviously there is no competition in most regions. There's not gross cost contracting in Wellington and Auckland, which has led to bus operating costs being 40% higher in those two cities than in Christchurch, where there was gross cost contracting. But the government has not listened to economists or public transport specialists. They have listened to the bus companies, who naturally want to maximize their profit by avoiding competition. And so what we've seen is a model tailored to their needs, to their desire to maximize profit. It's going to increase public transport fares for users. It increases the public transport subsidy that must be paid by Regional Council and the NZTA. And ultimately, it is not good for New Zealand's economy. It is good for the bus operators, the private monopolies that National protects.
Simon O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to